This is the Sri Ramana Maharshi satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and deeply meditate. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. Welcome. I'm Richard Clarke, hosting this satsang, and I love this teaching, and so I want to share it. Sharing it with you helps me better understand Ramana's words, so thank you. I'm reviewing and commenting on the book Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. This week is from Talk 97. Let me get to it. The first part is the questioner asks Ramana how to realize the heart. And Maharshi says, there is no one who even for a trice fails to experience the self, for no one admits that he stands apart from the self. He is the self. The self is the heart. Now, according to Advaita Vedanta, the ultimate reality, Brahman, is not separate from the individual self or Atman. They are one and the same, not two. The realization of this non-dual reality is the ultimate goal of spiritual practice. In the dialogue, the questioner asks how to realize the heart. In response, Ramana Maharshi states that there is no one who fails to experience the self, even for a moment. The heart he refers to is the Atman, or the true self. It is not any physical location. Rather, it is the source of our sense of being, our consciousness, our knowing awareness. This means that everyone, whether they notice it or not, is always experiencing the self, the heart. Ramana explains that no one admits to standing apart from the self because in reality, there is no separation between the individual self and the ultimate reality. The self is not something that is separate from us. It is our true nature. It is who you are right now, your very being and awareness. Ramana then goes on to say that the self is the heart. This means that the true nature of the individual self is not something that can be found by looking outward, but by turning inward and looking within. The heart he refers to is not a physical organ, but a metaphorical reference to the center of your being, the true self, or the Atman. So, to realize the heart, you must turn inward and recognize the true nature of the self as the non-dual reality, or the Atman, which is not separate from the ultimate reality, or Brahman. This realization is not an intellectual understanding, but a direct experience that can be found through spiritual practice, such as self-inquiry, meditation, or devotion to the divine. It is found in the knowledge from the direct experience of your own being. The next part is the questioner asks how to control the mind, and Maharshi replies, what mind? Whose is the mind? The devotee asks, the mind always wanders. I cannot control it. Maharshi replies, it is the nature of the mind to wander. You are not the mind. In this dialogue, the questioner asks Ramana how to control the mind. Common question among spiritual seekers, no matter what their practice is. In response, Ramana starts by asking the question, what is the mind? And whose is the mind? This is because in Advaita Vedanta, the mind is seen as an illusion or a construct of the ego, rather than a real entity existing in its own right. Understanding the nature of the mind and its source is essential to control of the mind. The questioner responds by saying that the mind always wanders and they can't control it. Ramana explains that it is of the nature of the mind to wander. The mind is like a monkey that constantly jumps from one branch to another, and it cannot be controlled by force. Then he gives a vital insight. You are not the mind. The true nature of the self is not the mind, but the pure awareness that underlies the mind. The mind is just a tool for the seeming individual to function in the apparent world. But the mind is not the true self itself. Trying to control the mind is like trying to hold on to a reflection in the mirror. Instead of trying to control the mind, Ramana Maharshi suggests that we simply observe it and let it do what it does. By observing the mind without judgment, we gain a better understanding of its nature and begin to detach from its influence. This detachment allows us to experience the true nature of the self, which is pure awareness beyond the mind. He tells us to discriminate the real from the unreal. This is to distinguish the temporary changing content of the mind from the unchanging awareness that lights up the mind with its consciousness. One is just an appearance. The other always is. Importantly, Ramana tells us to look to the source, where the mind and where the sense of I am come from. The mind is not settled by force of will. It is settled by knowledge, self-knowledge, direct knowledge of existence. The key message of this dialogue is that the mind cannot be controlled by force, and that by trying to do so only leads to frustration and suffering. Your true nature, the nature of the true self, is not the mind, but the pure awareness that underlies it. By observing the mind without judgment and understanding its true nature, we can begin to detach from its influence and experience the true nature of the self. Finally, when we realize the mind never really existed to begin with, we're free from its influence, which was only imagined after all. Then the dialogue continues. The devotee says, so one does not need to seek to control the mind? And the Maharshi says, there is no mind to control if you realize the self. The mind vanishing, the self shines forth. The questioner asks Ramana whether it is necessary to try to control the mind. Ramana responds by saying that if one realizes the self, there's no need to control the mind. When you no longer identify with the mind, it loses power and becomes still. Ramana goes on to explain that when the mind vanishes, the self shines forth. The self was there all along, only to be obscured by illusions of ego, including the mind and the world. The true nature of the self, which is pure awareness, becomes apparent when the mind is still. The mind is like a cloud that obscures the sun, but when the cloud dissolves, the sun shines forth. It was always there. The mind is a construct of the ego, which creates a false sense of identification from the ultimate reality, or Brahman. When we identify with the mind, we get caught up in its endless cycle of thoughts and emotions, which lead to suffering. However, when we realize the true nature of the self, which is non-dual and beyond the mind, we become free of the limitations of the ego. The goal of spiritual practice is not to control the mind, but is to realize the true nature of the self. This can be achieved through various spiritual practices like inquiry, meditation, and devotion to the divine. Ramana tells us that self-inquiry is the most direct means. By turning our attention inward and focusing on the true nature of the self, we can transcend the limitations of the mind and experience the infinite peace and bliss that is the self. The mind is an illusion created by the ego. Mind can be transcended by the knowledge that it was never real to begin with. Mind can be transcended through the realization of the true nature of the self. When we realize the self, the mind loses its power, and our true nature, the nature of the self, shines forth. It knows itself by itself, by its own power of knowing. And now we'll listen to my teacher, Nomi, with a discourse. Knowledge is non-objective. Mind is not.
The knowledge of one's being is non-objective. An idea, any kind of idea, is objective. What possible relation could it have to true knowledge? Every idea is conceived after the rise of the I notion, the assumed individual. And every idea is just as false as that assumption of the individuality or ego. Where that ego notion vanishes, there is true knowledge. It is non-objective, and it is that in which being is knowing. How else for that I to vanish except by deeply inquiring as to what your nature really is? You engage in any idea, in anything whatsoever, because you conceive of your happiness, your identity, or reality is mixed up with it. So if you say, I know this is unreal, I know this is not myself, and on the other hand say, but it still arises for me and I still get entangled in it, then you don't really know yet, do you? But if you deeply inquire to clarify what the nature of your identity is, you will know. And in that knowledge, the rise of ignorance becomes impossible. Examine yourself. What constitutes separation? You hear about the Absolute Self, or Brahman. You hear about being consciousness bliss, and that it is yourself. And yet you conceive of another yourself. What makes him up? He survives by non-inquiry. Inquiring is like bringing light to look for darkness. If you find out its nature, it will be destroyed. Destruction is final when it is found that that which is destroyed has actually been non-existent right from the start. So examine the so-called sense of individuality and all the tendencies that seem to be built up on it. Destruction of those vasanas or tendencies is the means to liberation or self-realization. Find out the root. Determine what you take to be your identity, what you define yourself as. All experience proceeds from there.
All right. And we're going to take a little bit of time to inquire and to make this experience our own. Notice that you exist, and you know that you exist without thinking about it or feeling it. You just know immediately and directly. It's self-evident. Now inquire and investigate within yourself. For whom is the mind? Who knows the mind? You know the mind. Does the mind know you? The mind wanders. Are you the mind? Do you wander? Or are you just the witness of the wandering mind? You are what is always. What is always doesn't move. Do you wander? Are you the mind? You know the mind. Does the mind know you? Who am I? What is the nature of my existence? What is it that really exists? Is it those things that are transient? Or is existence what is always there? What is always there? Who am I? All right. And we'll close with a chant. Om
Shanti.
Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace,
Peace.
peace, peace. All right. Comments or discussion?
Well, I'm just reminded that my mind can have a lot of tales to tell and embellishments and drama. But if I don't pay any attention to it, it's like a little kid finally sits down and be quiet.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't need to pursue any thought that is not welcome.
Uh-huh. That's
Yeah.
a powerful
Mhm.
knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. Controlling it has never seemed to work
Yes,
in my experience.
yes.
Yeah. So there is hope.
And it seems to me so much
And
of
go ahead.
so much of the practice is first learning about the mind and seeing how with the mind you go back and forth, and then finally seeing that you don't have to move when the mind moves.
Mhm. And everything the mind comes up with no longer exists or has not come into existence. And so I don't know what it thinks it's doing. It's all ephemeral stuff. Mhm.
Now, it seems like you're enjoying this today, Doug.
Well, I always enjoy it, actually. So today I am also. But yeah, I don't think my mind knows me, because if it did, it would not give me such a hard time.
Uh-huh. Yes.
I mean, we've been around a long time now, and
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And some say that one of the paths to realization is just being able to stay standing as the witness, just observing everything that is going past you. I think of it like Siddhartha standing by the river, and
Mhm.
finally, you're not the river, you just are. And that's enough.
Yeah. It's a great metaphor. And all the stuff that floats by in the river is a good metaphor.
so the mind is like the river. It's always flowing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right. And I guess when
Sometimes
we try to train the mind, we're trying to keep the river in its course
yeah.
Um,
because it's
Towards the
troublesome when it
bank
floods.
sometimes.
You're quiet today, Richard.
Just delighting in all of it. Yeah.
The power of satsang is great, I think.
Yeah. And the mind, yeah, is like the river, it flows into the sea, and you really are the sea.
Yes, yes. There's no difference between the river and the sea.
Mhm.
There's no difference between the drop and the ocean.
Right.
Oh, namaste. Again, very good being with you today. And
Wonderful.
Have good meditation, and we'll see you again next time.
Namaste.
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 Thank you, Richard.